He walked into the kitchen in the middle of the night, just to get water. But what he saw stopped him in his tracks. His maid, who he thought was inconspicuous and quiet, was sitting at her school books. What he did next shocked her. Subscribe and write in the comments what city you're from. The estate of Richard Blake stood like a monument to wealth and silence. Nestled behind tall iron gates and manicured hedges, it was the kind of house that had ceased being a home a long time ago. The marble floors shone with such relentless perfection they reflected more light than they absorbed. Chandeliers hung in every room, some imported from Vienna, others inherited through generations, all glinting coldly under recessed lighting. Classical music sometimes played through the ceiling speakers, but even that, Rachmaninoff and Chopin, sounded more like an afterthought than an invitation. Nothing was out of place. Nothing lived here in the true sense of the word. Richard Blake, the man who owned the silence, moved through it like a shadow. He was a man of 62, trim, poised, with eyes that had once been called piercing, but now felt more like wells, deep, distant, and sealed. He wore tailored suits and spoke with precision, even when silence would suffice. Since his wife's passing, there had been no guests, no gatherings, no idle conversation. The estate was run efficiently by a staff that operated in near invisibility. Meals appeared on time. Rooms were cleaned with surgical precision. Fresh flowers, always white, were arranged in silver vases and replaced every third day without fail. It was Amara who arranged them. She was the housemaid, young, soft-spoken, and forgettable in the way that domestic workers are often trained to be. She moved like breath through the halls, never lingering, never speaking unless spoken to. Her uniform, though impeccably clean, was always just a little too big. Her hair was always tied back in a tight bun, and her eyes rarely met anyone's. To Richard, she had been no more than a piece of the estate's rhythm, another silent cog in the machine that ensured his life remained untouched by friction. Until the night he saw her studying. It was an accident. He had woken, as he often did, at 2:15 a.m., restless and dry-mouthed. The house was wrapped in darkness save for a thread of light slicing across the floor beneath the kitchen door. Unusual. The staff retired by 10, and no one ever entered the kitchen after that hour. Still in his robe, he descended the grand staircase barefoot, his movements slow, not out of caution, but habit. The hush of the house was sacred, and even he walked as if it might be broken. He expected to find a flickering light bulb, or perhaps the chef's assistant having forgotten to turn off the fridge light. But when he turned the corner and pushed open the kitchen door, he stopped mid-step. Amara was there, not cooking or cleaning, but sitting at the marble island. The stark overhead light cast a pale glow over the table strewn with thick textbooks, a spiral notebook filled with dense, slanted handwriting, and several sheets with diagrams sketched in black ink. She wore an oversized gray sweater over her uniform, the sleeves rolled to her elbows. A pencil was tucked behind her ear. Her head was bent low, her brow furrowed in concentration. Richard did not move. Something about the scene felt fragile. Her lips moved silently, repeating something from the page. Anatomical terms, he guessed. He could make out the titles on the spines of the books. Advanced Human Biology. Fundamentals of Organic Chemistry. Diagnostic Procedures. It was so incongruous, so absurd, that for a moment he wondered if he was still asleep. Amara, his maid, was studying medicine. He cleared his throat, not harshly, but enough to remind her the world existed outside of the page. She jumped, nearly knocking over a cup of tea. Her eyes darted up in shock and, for the first time, truly met his. They were dark brown, large, and shining with the same startled intensity as a deer caught in headlights. I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, standing so quickly her stool scraped against the tile. I didn't think. He raised a hand, silencing her. "No," he said. "It's fine. I was just coming for water." She nodded too quickly. "Of course, sir, I'll leave." Again, he raised his hand. "You don't need to." A pause. He stepped toward the island, poured himself a glass from the chilled dispenser, then glanced at the open textbook. "What are you working on?" She hesitated, her hands knotting together in front of her. Then her eyes dropped to the floor. "An entrance exam," she said softly, "for an online pre-med program." He blinked. "I study after work," she continued, clearly unsure if she should. "I can't afford traditional classes, but if I pass this, I might qualify for a distance learning scholarship." He looked again at the books. None of them were new. Pages curled, margins filled with notes. There was even a diagram of a kidney, drawn carefully with colored pens. "You want to be a nurse?" he asked. Her head lifted slightly. There was something in her eyes now. Fire, not rebellion, but purpose. "A doctor," she said. He didn't respond. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. She stood, awkward and exposed, waiting for judgment, but none came. He simply nodded, set down his glass, and said, "Don't let me disturb you." He turned and walked back the way he came, but he paused in the hallway, staring at the sliver of light behind him. He had never truly seen her before. Not the girl who folded his shirts, wiped down his tables, and never asked for more than what was expected. Not the quiet figure who disappeared into the linen room and emerged hours later with everything pressed and perfect. He had seen a servant. And now, without warning, he had seen a soul. Back in his room, Richard did not return to bed. Instead, he stood at his window, watching the skeletal outlines of trees swaying in the night breeze. There was a stillness in his chest that he did not understand. Not discomfort, but something else. A stirring. The next morning, he asked the house manager casually how long Amara had been employed. "Almost 3 years, sir," came the reply. "She came highly recommended, reliable, never asks for anything, quiet. Family? None here. Sends money back to Louisiana, I believe." Richard nodded, said nothing more, but that night, and the one after, he couldn't help himself. At 2:15 a.m., he found himself pausing at the top of the stairs, listening, and each time he saw it. The glow under the kitchen door, the faint rustle of pages, the rhythm of someone fighting for something more. He began to notice her in the daylight, too. The way she handled fragile china like it was porcelain from her childhood. How she smiled, just slightly, when she saw sunlight hit the stained glass panel in the east hallway. How, even when no one watched, she treated every inch of the house as if it deserved care. He began to wonder about her dreams. Not the ones she dared to chase at night, but the ones she had as a child, the ones she perhaps never voiced aloud. He began to question things he had long held as truths, things he had inherited like wealth, attitudes, assumptions, blind spots. And so it began, not with a revelation, not with a transformation, but with a second glance. The kind of glance that, if allowed, could grow into something far more dangerous than curiosity. Recognition. That was where everything started. With a man who had everything and a girl who had nothing, and the light of a kitchen lamp piercing through glass walls. The next morning, Richard found himself seated at the far end of the breakfast table, his newspaper unfolded but unread, the coffee before him growing steadily colder. Across the sunlit room, the sound of polished shoes echoed faintly as the butler went about his usual routine, and the distant hum of a vacuum cleaner suggested that the day had begun just as it always did. Everything was in order, precisely as it should be. Yet the stillness, once comforting, had taken on a different edge, as though something fundamental had shifted beneath the marble floors and high ceilings. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt loyal. It felt heavy, watching. Richard tapped a finger against his cup and tried to return to the article before him. It was something about a real estate merger, the kind of business move he would have once analyzed with interest, but the words blurred into meaningless columns. His mind, despite every effort to the contrary, drifted back to the night before. The image of Amara hunched over her books, her face lit by the kitchen lamp, concentration written in every line of her body. He told himself it was an anomaly, a curiosity, a private eccentricity he had stumbled upon and ought to forget. But he couldn't. The scene had rooted itself into his consciousness like a thorn, not because it disturbed the order of his house, but because it had cracked something in the order of his thinking. Later that morning, under the guise of routine oversight, he called for Mr. Denham, the house manager. Denham was punctual, composed, and deeply loyal, a man who understood the necessity of discretion as much as he understood flower rotations and payroll. "How long has the girl Amara been here?" Richard asked, as though the thought had occurred to him idly. Denham adjusted his glasses. 3 years and 2 months, sir." "She came to us from another estate?" "Yes, sir, a private residence in Connecticut. Before that, a few short-term positions, mostly live-in arrangements, always well-reviewed. She keeps to herself." "And her family?" Denham hesitated. "She sends most of her wages back home. Louisiana, I believe. I believe she has younger siblings. She never discusses them. She's exceptionally private." Richard nodded slowly. "And her behavior? You've never had complaints?" "Never, sir." Denham's answer was immediate, assured. If I may say so, she's one of the most reliable we've had. Does her work impeccably, asks for nothing, avoids any form of conflict. We hardly know she's there. That last sentence struck Richard more sharply than he expected. We hardly know she's there. As though that were a virtue. As though invisibility were the ideal quality in a person. He dismissed Denham and returned to his office, but he couldn't escape the sense that he had just uncovered the edges of something long overlooked. An entire life that had unfolded beneath his roof, quiet as breath, steady as clockwork, and yet entirely unseen. That night, he paused at the top of the stairs again, this time not out of restlessness, but from something closer to intent. The hallway was dim, the grandfather clock ticking softly in the foyer below. The thread of light under the kitchen door was there again, pale and constant. He descended, slowly, carefully, uncertain of what he hoped to find, or what he would say if she noticed him. He did not enter the kitchen this time. He stood just outside the doorway where he could hear the gentle shuffle of pages, the scratch of pen against paper, and her voice, soft, almost inaudible, repeating a list of anatomical terms. There was determination in her tone, but also fatigue. Her vowels curled slightly, Louisiana twining around Latin, and yet the words were clear. He stood there longer than he meant to. Something about the intimacy of it, the private struggle, the sheer discipline of someone squeezing a dream into borrowed hours, left him oddly moved. He returned upstairs before she ever knew he had been there. The next day, he noticed more. It wasn't that Amara had changed. On the contrary, she behaved exactly as she always had. But now he saw her. He saw the way she gently nudged the door to avoid creaking it open, how she folded shirts with a precision born of ritual, not compulsion. He noticed the faded edges of her shoes, the way her fingers lingered over the piano keys when she dusted them, as if listening for an echo from another life. She hummed under her breath sometimes, just barely, a tune unfamiliar to him, but warm. It began to unsettle him. And then, one afternoon, he overheard her speaking quietly on the phone near the service entrance. He wasn't eavesdropping, at least not intentionally, but the door was ajar, and her voice, hushed and trembling, carried just enough. "No, I haven't told them. I can't lose a job, Mari. You know I can't. If I pass, then maybe. Just maybe. But if I fail, then what was it all for?" Silence. "I'm trying. I really am. Just pray for me. Please. I don't have much time." He walked away before she noticed him, a tightness curling in his chest. There was something unbearably intimate about hearing someone confess their fear to a voice on the other end of the line, especially when that fear was so layered in sacrifice. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for the name of the pre-med program she had mentioned. It took him less than 10 minutes to find it. An online curriculum affiliated with a reputable state university. The entrance exam was a prerequisite. The tuition, once accepted, was modest by his standards, but steep for anyone earning minimum wage. There were no scholarships listed. He scrolled through pages of requirements, deadlines, student testimonials. He read the course list twice. Then he closed the browser and sat in the darkness, unsure of what he was doing or why he cared. The next few days passed in a strange haze. Business calls, financial reports, the quiet, frictionless slide of another privileged week. But beneath the surface of his routine, Richard felt the pressure building. He watched Amara more often now, watched the way she served breakfast, always without eating herself. Watched her slip out into the garden on Sundays and water the hedges long after anyone else would bother. Watched her fingertips brush the edges of the books on his shelves like a prayer. One evening, after dinner, he stood by the drawing-room window, scotch in hand, watching the sun burn into the horizon. Behind him, the house was quiet. The only sound came from the east wing, the sound of a vacuum cleaner stopping and starting again. Then silence. He thought of what his father would have said, that a man should never get involved in the affairs of his staff, that charity was a dangerous distraction, that kindness, unchecked, bred dependency, and yet all Richard could think about was a look in Amara's eyes that night in the kitchen. Not fear, not hope, but purpose. Undeniable, steady purpose. The following week, something changed. He saw her again in the hallway late at night, crouched by the laundry room, books sprawled across her knees. She didn't notice him until he cleared his throat, gently, so as not to frighten her. She looked up, startled but composed. "I didn't mean to." "It's all right," he said. "You're not in trouble." She nodded, unsure. "May I ask, what drives you?" he said, the words sounding foreign in his own mouth. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. "When I was 10, my father died in our home. There was no doctor in town. We couldn't afford the hospital. I sat beside him for hours. He kept apologizing. I swore I would never feel that helpless again." He said nothing. He didn't need to. In her voice, he heard the echo of something long buried within himself, a grief so vast it had frozen him for years. He turned without a word, leaving her in the quiet. But that night, in the solitude of his office, he pulled out a sheet of paper and began to draft an inquiry. Not to her school, but to his lawyer. The beginnings of a scholarship fund. Anonymous, clean, irrefutable. He didn't know why he was doing it. Not really, but something inside him whispered that sometimes the smallest light could alter the shape of an entire room. And for the first time in years, he no longer feared the quiet. He welcomed it, because it was no longer empty. The morning after Richard sent the message to his lawyer, he awoke earlier than usual. The sky beyond the tall arched windows was still smeared with the last shadows of night, and the scent of brewing coffee had not yet filtered through the halls. Something in him felt restless, like a page half turned. He rose, dressed in silence, and stepped into the quiet corridors of his estate, not yet sure what he intended to find or do. He had become attuned to the rhythms of the house in a way he had never cared to before. He knew, for instance, that Amara would be in the east corridor before 6, folding linen in the side room that connected to the greenhouse. When he found her there, she was bent over a basket of towels, hands moving with steady efficiency. The light from the window bathed her in a faint gold, and for a moment, he simply stood there, watching. Not as a man surveying his employee, but as someone slowly unraveling a mystery long overlooked. Her back was straight, her eyes focused, her jaw tight with concentration. There was nothing languid in her movements. Everything she did held a quiet urgency, like she was always running out of time. She noticed him then and straightened, startled. He could see the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She seemed to brace herself, though for what, he wasn't sure. "I hope I didn't disturb you," she said quickly, eyes downcast. "Not at all," Richard replied. He paused, then added, "I was walking." A silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but thick with something unsaid. He took a step closer, then gestured toward the linens. "You do this every morning." She nodded. "Before breakfast is set. The humidity in the greenhouse sometimes affects the linen room." Of course it did. He had never known that. In 3 decades of living in the estate, he had never once considered the effect of greenhouse humidity on stored linen. But she had. She saw the details, the things he had always missed. There was another pause. He cleared his throat. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, uncertain why the words came so gently. She looked confused, but nodded again. He led her through the glass door into the greenhouse. It was warm inside, the scent of damp soil and blooming jasmine surrounding them. Sunlight filtered in through the curved ceiling, painting the floor in shifting patterns. Richard gestured to a wrought iron bench beneath a hanging fern, and after a brief hesitation, she sat. He remained standing. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you told me, about your father." She looked up at him, eyes steady now. "I haven't told many people," she said. "I can see why," he replied. "It wasn't an easy thing to share." Amara shrugged lightly. "It's not about easy, it's about true." That word stayed with him. He sat across from her, resting his hands on his knees. For a long moment, he simply studied her face. There were lines of fatigue around her eyes, and her skin bore the quiet dullness of someone who slept too little and worked too much. But there was a light in her gaze that no amount of exhaustion could dull. "You want to be a doctor," he said. "Yes. Why not a nurse or a technician? Something less demanding." She tilted her head slightly, considering his question. When she answered, her voice was calm, certain. "Because I don't want to stop halfway." That answer settled in his chest like a weight. "You could have chosen something easier," he said. "I could have," she agreed. "But people die where I come from because there's no one to help. Not just to clean wounds or take vitals, but to decide, to act. I want to be the one who knows what to do." Richard was quiet. The wind shifted outside, brushing against the greenhouse panes. He looked away, suddenly aware of how cold his hands felt. "I never knew my wife had cancer," he said finally. "Not until it was too late." Amara didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. "She didn't tell me," he continued. "I was busy. Meetings, markets, acquisitions. I thought she was tired. Thought she'd recover. By the time I understood, there wasn't anything to be done." "I'm sorry," Amara said softly. He shook his head. "I think I was sorry too late." They sat in silence. Not the brittle silence of discomfort, but the rich, dense quiet that came when two people sat in the presence of shared truths. "I'm not telling you this to compare griefs," he added, "but I see something in you, something that reminds me